What is going on, everyone? Chris Vincelli here. Welcome to my YouTube channel, the YouTube channel that discusses personal development, finances, and everyday life experiences. And in today's video, I'm going to get a little personal with you guys. I'm going to talk about how I learned to speak 5 languages. I'm also going to discuss what you can do to learn pretty much any language you want and learn it to a point where you actually become fluent and comfortable in that language. And I'm also going to reveal which language was hardest for me to master, the one that I had the hardest time really becoming comfortable with. So I'm going to reveal which one of these 5 languages is the most complicated and the hardest to master for me. All right, so I'm going to dive into it in just a second. But first, if you haven't done so already, go ahead and subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell. Or really, you have to hit that notification bell or else you won't be notified when I come out with other great and similar content. So go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can be made aware every time I come out with other great content. And if you end up liking this video, go ahead and smash that like button. It really helps me a lot. It helps with the YouTube algorithm. YouTube likes it when people like videos, and the videos that get the most likes end up being the ones that get recommended the most by YouTube as well. So please go ahead and smash that like button. It's really gonna help me a lot. Okay guys, so let me dive right into it. Let me talk about the 5 languages that I speak and how I learned them. And despite the ease with which I am speaking to you guys in English, and probably despite the fact that you're not hearing any distinct accent, I mean, it's probably a North American accent, but you're not really picking anything else up. It's purely English. Despite that fact, English is actually not my native language. My native language is Italian. I grew up with 2 Italian parents. I was born and raised in Canada. However, my parents spoke to me in Italian for much of my youth. It was the first language that I learned. It's a language I still speak and understand today. And so learning Italian for me was, I had no choice. I had to learn Italian. I grew up in an Italian household. My parents spoke to me in Italian. My grandparents spoke to me in Italian. I had no choice. I had to pick up Italian. With that being said, obviously being born and raised in Canada and growing up in Canada, I didn't use Italian on a daily basis outside of the home. In fact, after a certain age, I started speaking English to my parents instead of Italian. So after a while, I noticed that my Italian was beginning to deteriorate. And throughout my teenage years and even to my early adulthood, it was deteriorating to a point where I no longer felt comfortable in Italian. So what I did in order to maintain and improve my knowledge of Italian was that I actually studied Italian in school. I took Italian classes while I was in university, and I actually ended up studying in Italy in my last semester of college. That really helped me to become comfortable with the Italian language again. That really helped me reacquire the Italian language. So yeah, Italian is actually my native language, and despite the fact that I don't speak it on a regular basis, I did take active steps to reacquire my knowledge and my comfort with Italian, and to a point where now I can have conversations in Italian. I can go to Italy and converse with the locals. And to be honest, I'm quite happy that I was able to preserve my native language and my parents' native language as well. So that's how I learned Italian. English, of course, came naturally to me as well. Once I started going to school, started watching TV, making friends in the neighborhood, I was forced to pick up English. I had no choice. I mean, the language of instruction at school was English, and I had no choice but to pick up English, to learn English. And of course, I was living in a predominantly English-speaking country on an English-speaking continent. So I had to pick up English. English was going to come to me naturally through everyday life, through society. And I gotta say, not only did I pick up English, English actually ended up being my dominant language. Even though it's not my native language, it is now my dominant language. It is the language that I think in, that I dream in. It is my default language, the language that I use in my day-to-day life. Learning English, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory as to why I learned English, how I learned English, and why it has become the language that, frankly, I'm most fluent in at this point. Then, of course, there's French. Now, while I was born and raised in Canada, which is a predominantly English-speaking country, and I was brought up in the English-speaking school system, I actually was born and raised in the predominantly French part of Canada. So all my friends and my family spoke to each other in English, And while I studied in English, the greater society around me was actually predominantly French. That meant that, of course, I also studied French at school as well. Actually, one interesting point I gotta say was that even though my schooling was done in English, I was placed in the French immersion programs of the schools that I went to. That means that while the educational institution was, an English-speaking institution, about 50% of my day was still spent in classes where the language of instruction was French. So I learned French at school. And then, of course, after school, whether I'd play on the hockey team or taking skiing lessons, I would speak French pretty often. Maybe not with my immediate circle of friends, but folks in the neighborhood, kids on the hockey team, my ski instructor. I would be speaking French to these people on a, if not daily, and definitely on a weekly basis. And of course, my comfort with French grew as I started working full-time up in Canada. Most of my clients, I gotta say, were French speaking. I think maybe 50% of the staff at where I worked was French speaking as well. So I had to become very, very comfortable and pretty much master the French language as well. So that is how I learned French. I was basically forced to learn French. I was immersed in French. In the French speaking part of Canada, they take French very seriously. So if you want to get a high paying job or if you want to see any sort of career advancement, you really do need to master the French language. That is, of course, exclusively in the more French-speaking region of Canada. Next comes Spanish. Now, I learned Spanish relatively late in my life. I think I was like 18 or 19, and I was going to a junior college up in Canada, and I was deciding on what type of classes I should take for that semester. And I think the Spanish teacher just like walked up to me and said, "Hey, do you want to learn Spanish?" And I figured, well, I already knew 2 Latin-based Romance languages already. I knew Italian and I knew French, and of course Spanish being another Latin-based language, Romance language. I figured that, hey, learning Spanish might actually be pretty easy. Might be an easy A on my report card. So I ended up taking Spanish classes kind of midway through my time in junior college up in Canada. And I found that learning Spanish was actually pretty easy. Like I said, my background in Italian and French helped a lot in acquiring Spanish, namely because they're all part of the same language family. They're all the Romance languages. And so I got the chance to learn Spanish in junior college. I was also lucky with the fact that right after that semester, once that semester ended, we ended up taking a family trip down to Mexico, to Cancun, Mexico, and I did the best I can in speaking with the staff at the resort that we were staying at. So, and speaking to the staff in Spanish as opposed to English. So not only did I take Spanish when I was in junior college, but I also got the chance to practice my Spanish immediately after. And then when I ended up studying for my master's program, I ended up also taking additional Spanish courses, taking beginners and intermediate level Spanish. So I've taken Spanish classes over the years, over the last decade and a half. I've had opportunities to practice my Spanish as well, particularly when visiting Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America and Spain as well, in Europe. And so that's pretty much how I learned Spanish. And I have to say, like I said, my background in Italian and French, which are both Romance languages, really helped me in acquiring Spanish. Okay, and finally, Portuguese. Portuguese, I have to say, is the language that I'm least comfortable with, but I'm still able to communicate with people in Portuguese. I ended up taking a Portuguese class while studying for my master's. And similar to the rationale for taking Spanish, I was already very comfortable with several Romance, Latin-based languages at that time. My Spanish was improving. And of course, Italian and French were already languages I was comfortable with for many years, in fact, decades at that point. So I said, why not? Might as well learn Portuguese. It's a very important language in South America and in several countries in Africa as well. It's also the official language of Portugal in Europe. And while I did have a lot of fun in learning Portuguese, and I learned it very, very well during that semester in my master's program, I didn't have many instances in practicing Portuguese after I had finished my class. I didn't travel to any Portuguese-speaking countries for a little while. I'd been to Brazil, but that was several years after I'd taken that course. So that probably explains why, out of all the languages, I'm probably least comfortable with Portuguese, namely because I haven't had many opportunities to practice that language. I'm going to tell you guys a couple things about learning languages, namely 2 things that you can do to learn languages as quickly and as best as possible. Number 1, I have to say that probably the best way to learn a language is to immerse yourself in that language, with that language. You want to live in a part of the world where everyone around you speaks the language that you're trying to learn. So in my case, obviously, living in North America, I was surrounded by English-speaking people. I had to learn English. But of course, I was also immersed with French because I was living in a French corner of North America. So I had the benefit of being immersed in both an English-speaking and French-speaking environment. That enabled me to become fluent in both languages. I have to say that, yes, I'm fluent in both English and French at this point. And that's because I was immersed in both of those languages. Same with Italian. I had no choice but to speak Italian when I was a kid. And then when I really wanted to improve and refine my Italian, I decided to study in Italy, where I had no choice but to speak Italian to everyone on a daily basis. That also explains why I probably didn't master Spanish and especially Portuguese to the same extent, namely because I've never lived in a Spanish or Portuguese speaking country. I never had the chance to immerse myself in those languages. Yes, I've traveled through Latin America, but of course, taking a vacation down to Colombia or Mexico for a week is not the same as living somewhere for several months or years. So I have to say, if you're planning on learning a different language, try to learn that language in a country where people speak that language, and maybe live in a country where people don't really speak English, so you're kind of forced to speak in the language that you're trying to learn. And I guess here's a bit of a cheat or a bit of a hack when it comes to learning languages, and that is to try to learn a language that is already in the same language family as a language that you already know. So for example, in my case, it was very easy for me to acquire Spanish and Portuguese because they are in the same language family as Italian and French. They're all Romance languages. They're all in the same Romance language family. So learning those languages was pretty easy. My knowledge of Italian and French really helped me understand and learn Spanish and Portuguese. They're all part of the same language family. So for example, if you know Spanish and you want to learn another language, Italian might be the easiest language for you to learn, or maybe even Portuguese. French is a little harder, but still within the same language family. Same thing can be said for, some of the Germanic languages. If you happen to know German already, it might be easy for you to learn a language like Dutch. Or for example, with the Slavic languages, if you already know Ukrainian, then learning another language like Russian would be really easy, namely because it's in the same language family. So keep that in mind whenever you're trying to learn different languages. If you do want to learn another language, it will help you a lot if you already have a background in another language within the same language family. Okay, and like I promised, I'm going to reveal to you right now the language that was hardest for me to acquire. And yes, I'm not super comfortable in Spanish. I'm not super comfortable in Portuguese, but it was pretty easy learning them. The hardest language for me to acquire was French. Honestly, that language, it's a great language. It's a very useful language. French is the official language of several countries in Europe, in Africa, and in several places in the Caribbean as well. But man, that is a language that is hard to learn because of all the rules, because of the interesting ways of pronouncing words. And sometimes, in fact, I'll say many times, the spelling of a word does not reflect how the word is pronounced. It's so weird. In Italian or Spanish or even English, the O sound is spelt with an O. The U sound is spelt with a U. That's not the case in French, okay? They got so many different rules and way to spell things, and it really makes learning French a little bit more difficult. I'll give you a couple of examples. A word like écureuil. Look at how it's spelt. Why is écureuil spelt that way? I mean, you would think that you should pronounce an L at the end of the word because of how it's spelled, but you don't hear an L in the word écureuil, but it's there. There's the L at the end of the word. Why is it not pronounced? Same thing with a word like feuille. Why are there two L's in the middle of the word feuille? There's no L being pronounced in the word. And the same could be said for a word like grand. Most of us would pronounce it grand, but in French, you pronounce this word grand. I mean, the beginning of the word kind of makes sense, G-R-A, but you don't really hear an N or a D when pronouncing grand. So it's interesting. It's a great language. It's a very useful language, but I just don't get the spelling sometimes. French-speaking people, can you explain why French was made to be so difficult? Some things just frankly don't make sense to me. Honnêtement, Des fois, je pense que le français a été créé pour être difficile par exprès. So that's it, guys. It was a bit of a personal video, but I hope you've learned something. Namely, if you want to learn a language, the best thing that you can do is to immerse yourself in that language, to really live in an environment where you have no choice but to speak that language. And if your goal is to just acquire as many languages as possible, or to maybe just learn a few more, it might help to learn languages that are similar to other languages that you already know. Languages that are already in the same language family as the language that you are already familiar with. So guys, thanks again. And like I said, subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you can be notified every single time I come out with other great and similar content. And if you like this video, which I'm sure you did, go ahead and smash that like button. It's really gonna help me a lot, guys. And by the way, I'm also on Instagram, so go ahead and follow me there. I would love to see you. Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.